Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you're here, taking a quiet moment to rest and unwind. Tonight, we'll travel back through time to the years when the world changed forever after the arrival of the Black Death. Before we begin, tell me, from which part of the world are you joining tonight? Are you listening from a city where lights still glow against the sky? Or from a quieter place where the night feels calm and still? Wherever you are, settle in. Let your thoughts slow down, and let this story take you gently into the past. The nights grew quieter, but not peaceful. That's how many people described Europe after the plague arrived. Life, once filled with familiar evening sounds, bells, laughter, footsteps, prayers, became silent. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in, the way illness often does. Quietly at first, and then everywhere at once. In 1347, a ship docked at the port of Messina, in Sicily. It had come from the east, carrying goods, sailors, and something invisible. Rats on board carried fleas, infected with a deadly bacterium. From that one harbor, the sickness spread quickly through Italy and across Europe. By the time people understood what was happening, it was already too late. Before the plague, nighttime had been the heart of community life. Families shared meals, neighbors talked by firelight, and monks rang bells to mark evening prayers. Cities and villages followed the rhythm of those sounds. But when the plague spread, the rhythm stopped. The same bells that once called people to prayer began to toll for the dead. Some rang constantly, while others went completely silent because the sound brought too much sorrow. After sunset, streets emptied. People stayed inside, afraid that the air itself carried disease. They closed their doors, sealed their windows, and tried to make their homes feel safe. Many believed that bad air, kayed miasma, caused the sickness. To fight it, they burned herbs like rosemary and lavender, hoping the smoke would purify the air. Candles were kept burning through the night, both for light and protection. The flicker of a flame became a sign of life inside a quiet home. In that silence, people began to notice time differently. Days and nights blended together. Without the noise of markets or travelers, the sound of wind or a distant bell became something you listened for. The world slowed down. Some found comfort in writing or prayer. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio described how people left the cities and gathered in small groups in the countryside, telling stories to pass the dark hours. They used words to keep fear away. For many, the act of storytelling itself became a form of survival. Before this time, few people measured time in hours. There were no clocks in homes. People relied on the sun, the moon, or the toll of a church bell. But after the plague, that began to change. When life felt uncertain, people searched for ways to make time more predictable. Churches built new bell towers, and early mechanical clocks appeared in town squares. Time became something people wanted to control, to hold on to because they had seen how fragile it could be. Above them, the night sky remained the same. The stars didn't change, though the world below them had. In the stillness, people began to look upward more often. Some found comfort in the stars. Others saw them as signs or warnings. But their quiet study of the heavens would, in time, inspire new ways of thinking about the earth, about science, and about our place in the universe. The Black Death brought fear, but it also brought reflection. People began to see life and time more clearly. They understood how quickly things could change, and how precious each quiet moment could be. So when you look at the night tonight, whether through a window or while lying in bed, remember that silence has always been part of the human story. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to hold on to light. They stayed awake beside their candles, listened to the silence, and waited for morning. The night became quieter. Yes, but in that quiet, humanity learned how to endure. When the world began to fall silent, people turned toward small things for comfort, flame, prayer, and habit. The candle became more than a source of light. It became a companion. In homes across Europe, candles were lit not just to see, but to feel safe. The soft glow reminded people that they were still alive, still part of something fragile but enduring. Families would gather around a single candle at night, its light trembling against walls that once heard laughter and song. Now, those same rooms echoed only with whispers and the crackle of wax. Many believed light could push back the plague itself. They thought darkness hid disease, that shadows carried spirits of the dead. So candles burned through long nights, filling homes with the smell of tallow or beeswax. Some burned blessed candles one's priests had prayed over. Others made their own and whispered words of protection as they lit the wick. In villages, Night watchmen once walked the streets, carrying lanterns, calling out the hour to let people know all was well. But during the plague years, many of those calls stopped. People closed their doors to the sound, not wanting to hear news of who had fallen ill. The idea of nighttime changed it, no longer meant rest or gathering. It became something to endure. Yet human beings always find ways to create meaning, even in darkness. Monks in monasteries continued their ancient rhythm of prayer. They woke before dawn, when the sky was still deep blue, to chant in cold stone halls. Their voices rose and echoed, filling the emptiness with calm. Outside, those who survived heard faint sounds of chanting through the still air, and perhaps it reminded them that not all had ended. Across cities like Florence, London, and Paris, healers began to appear in the dark, strange figures wearing long cloaks and bird-shaped masks. They carried candles too, their soft light reflecting off glass eye lenses. Inside the mask was a mix of herbs and flowers, meant to filter the air. To see one of these plague doctors at night, moving slowly through the streets with a flickering candle, was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. It meant someone was still trying to help. Inside homes, families formed small rituals to feel safe. They burned herbs in bowls, sage, rosemary, or juniper, believing that the smoke could keep sickness away. The scent of herbs and melting wax filled every corner. It was the smell of survival. Many prayed before sleeping, whispering words for loved ones lost. They prayed not to wake with fever, and when they did wake, they thanked God quietly, because another morning meant another chance. Night after night, that rhythm: light the candle, say a prayer, breathe the smoke, became a way to hold the world together. As months passed, something subtle happened. The fear of darkness began to change. People started to treat the night not only as a threat but as a time for thought. When so many voices were gone, silence gave space for reflection. Writers, monks, and thinkers began to wonder why the world worked as it did. They began to keep journals, simple records of what they saw, who survived, what patterns the sickness followed. Those quiet writings, often made by candlelight, became some of the first efforts toward what we now call observation in science. It's strange, isn't it, that out of fear and loss, humans began to look more closely at the world. The same silence that once frightened them began to teach them how to notice. Night became not only a time of waiting, but of learning. Te plagedidinti. Just change how people lived. It changed how they thought about night itself. The darkness wasn't only something to be feared anymore. It became a space where thought could grow, where light and silence could coexist. So tonight, as you sit here in your own quiet space, perhaps with a small light nearby, imagine those distant homes centuries ago, a single candle burning through long hours, people speaking softly, the world outside hushed, different time, same hope, to make it through the night. After the first waves of the plague passed, people began to notice that even their sleep had changed. Before the sickness, night had been full of ordinary sounds. A dog barking, a cart rolling on stone, voices fading after supper. Now, those sounds were gone. The silence that followed the plague was heavy and had reached into every home. Sleep came differently. For many it came in fragments, a few hours, a brief waking, then drifting again. People spoke of strange dreams, dreams filled with faces of the lost. Doctors of the time, though they understood little of disease, wrote about these restless nights. They said the mind was trying to heal from what the eyes had seen in daylight. Fear lingered after sunset. Even when the disease faded, people hesitated to walk alone at night. They believed the spirits of plague victims still wandered through alleys and fields. In many tones, it became custom to avoid talking about the dead after dark. Silence was a form of respect and perhaps protection. But not all the changes were dark ones. Because the world had grown quieter, people began to listen more closely to the rhythms of the night itself. They heard the sound of the wind against shutters, the faint hoot of an owl, the whisper of trees. What had once been background noise now became familiar companions. It was as if nature had stepped in to fill the empty spaces left by human voices. The pattern of sleep in the 14th century was not like ours today. Most people did not sleep straight through the night. They slept in two parts, what historians now call first sleep and second sleep. Between these two rests, there was a time of quiet wakefulness. People might sit up, pray, or simply think. It was a gentle pause in the middle of darkness. After the plague, this middle period took on new meaning. It became a time for reflection, a calm space when one could be grateful to have made it through another day. Families used this interval to share small words, light a candle, or check on one another. Children who woke from bad dreams were comforted softly, told that the light would soon return. In so many homes, a single ember was kept glowing all night, so that the flame could be revived easily if someone stirred. The glow became a sign that life still continued. Dreams themselves changed. Monks and scholars recorded visions of cities empty and silent, of processions of the dead moving quietly toward light. But others dreamed of renewal, of fields growing again, of bells ringing once more. Such dreams were spoken of in the mornings, cautiously but with hope. They reminded people that even the mind sought to rebuild after loss. In time, writers began to describe sleep as something sacred, almost like prayer. To sleep and wake unharmed was considered a blessing. And so, nighttime prayers spread widely, small verses whispered before lying down, words of thanks for the day and pleas for the morning to come. This ritual survived long after the plague itself was gone. Even centuries later, the habit of praying or lighting a small candle before bed continued in many homes across Europe. It became part of culture, not fear. A quiet act of gratitude carried forward by generations who no longer remembered exactly why it began. The silence of the plague years had reshaped the meaning of night. It was no longer only a time to rest, but a space where the boundary between fear and peace could be felt closely. People had learned that darkness could hold both danger and comfort, and that surviving it required gentleness. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that long ago stillness. A small house, the air cool, a candle's light soft against the wall. Outside, the world waits in quiet, but inside, someone breathes calmly, safe for now. That small peace, found in the middle of uncertainty, is what carried humanity forward. As the years passed and the worst of the plague faded, something unexpected began to grow from the silence it had left behind. People started to make sense of what had happened, not only through words, but through images, symbols, and small acts of remembrance. Art, belief, and early medicine all began to change, and much of that change began at night. Artists were among the first to face the new stillness. Before the plague, paintings and carvings often showed saints, kings, or peaceful villages. Afterward, a darker tone appeared. In churches, walls once bright with color were repainted with images of death and judgment. Candles flickered beneath paintings of skeletons, open graves, and winged angels weighing souls. It might sound frightening now, but to those who lived through it, such images were not morbid. They were reminders that life was fragile and worth protecting. Monks worked long hours by candlelight, copying texts and prayers meant to comfort the fearful. Their ink dried slowly in the dim glow, while outside, the wind pressed softly against stone windows. Every written line was an effort to make sense of the unknown. They believed that understanding suffering, recording it might help prevent it from returning. Doctors, or those who called themselves doctors, also began to think differently. Before the plague, medical practice had been guided mostly by old ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. Illness was thought to come from imbalances in the body's humors. But the plague had ignored every rule. It spread too fast, too widely, and no amount of herbs or prayers seemed to stop it. So, quietly, some healers began to question the old ways. At night, by lantern or candle, they wrote notes on what they saw, who survived, who didn't, which herbs seemed to help. They didn't yet understand infection, but they were beginning to observe patterns. Those small observations, scribbled in the dim light, became the first steps toward modern medical thinking. Meanwhile, common people clung to beliefs that gave them a sense of control. Superstition filled the long nights. Some carried charms made of silver or bone. Others hung bunches of garlic, dried flowers, or even small mirrors near their beds. They believed these could reflect sickness away or trap evil spirits. The smell of burning herbs filled the air, lavender, sage, rosemary, partly to mask the scent of death, but also to bring comfort. For many, those rituals worked not through science, but through calm. They gave structure to the endless uncertainty. And so, night after night, a strange balance formed. Religion, superstition, and the earliest glimmers of science, all sharing the same quiet space. The candle became a symbol of that balance. Not only a tool, but a reminder that light and darkness always existed together. Art reflected this as well. In manuscripts, tiny paintings showed people holding candles beside open graves, or angels guiding souls through the stars. Painters added soft halos of light around faces, capturing the glow of faith in dark times. The candle's flame, small but steady, became one of the most powerful symbols in European art, a sign of endurance. Even the architecture of cities changed. Churches and town halls began to build taller windows to let in more daylight, as if people no longer trusted darkness. But at night, the same buildings became places of gathering again. After years of isolation, music slowly returned. Simple songs and chants rose in the echoing halls, not the loud celebrations of the past, but gentle harmonies that sounded almost like prayers. These small shifts, in art, in medicine, in faith, would guide Europe into a new age. But at the time, no one knew they were standing at the edge of transformation. They were simply trying to live one night at a time. The people who had seen so much loss began to see the night differently. It was no longer only a shadow to fear. It was a space for remembering, for questioning, for rebuilding. The same darkness that had once hidden danger now held the beginnings of thought and creativity. And so, as torches dimmed and candles burned low, people began to rebuild the world by the gentlest light imaginable, the light of reflection. When the plague finally began to fade, it did not disappear all at once. It left behind gaps, empty homes, silent streets, and smaller villages. But slowly, life began to return, and with it, the rhythm of human sound. At first, people moved cautiously. Markets reopened, but crowds were thin. Churches rang their bells again, but softly, as if afraid to break the fragile calm that had settled over everything. The survivors had learned to live more quietly. They spoke in lower tones, walked slower, and looked at each sunset as something precious. Nighttime, once feared, began to change shape again. For the first time in many years, people started to gather after dark. Not in large groups, but in small circles, neighbors sitting together by firelight, sharing bread, or telling stories about those who were gone. The voices that rose in those hours were not the old ones of joy and celebration, but of memory. They spoke of how things used to be, and how they might be again. Music returned slowly, like a small stream thawing after winter. Minstrels, who had vanished during the worst years, began to appear in towns once more. Their songs were gentler than before, not about kings or battles, but about faith, loss, and love that endured. People listened quietly, some smiling, some wiping away tears. The music wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine for the heart. In villages, work resumed by daylight, but night remained a time of thought. Fires glowed in hearths, and candles burned longer. Those who could write began keeping records of harvests, of births, of small things that marked the return of life. The habit of recording, started by monks and healers during the plague, spread among townsfolk too. In that sensei, even the idea of keeping journals, of documenting one's world, grew from the quiet of those post-plague nights. Children born after the plague knew little of the fear their parents had felt, but they grew up hearing the stories. Every flicker of a candle, every whisper before sleep, carried a trace of memory, a lesson not to take peace for granted. Parents taught their children simple evening habits: to light a candle, to say a small prayer, to close the day with gratitude. And though the reason behind these habits slowly faded, the practice itself remained for centuries. Work, too, began to adapt to a world changed by the plague. Because so many laborers were gone, those who survived found their time more valuable. For the first time, many workers were paid better wages. This meant more homes could afford small comforts, better food, thicker blankets, stronger doors. At night, instead of collapsing from exhaustion, people began to rest with a little more ease. Night became gentler again, more forgiving. The streets, once abandoned, began to glow faintly with new kinds of light. Lanterns were hung outside inns and along main roads in some towns, an early form of street lighting. They didn't make the nights bright, but they offered a feeling of safety. Travelers who had once feared sleeping outdoors could now see faint lights guiding them home. That small change light in the streets marked the beginning of a shift that would continue for centuries. In that self-flickering world, nighttime became something human again. It was no longer just a time between danger and dawn. It was a space for rebuilding, for talking, healing, and slowly remembering how to hope. Some say that in those years, people learned to love the quiet. They found that not all silence is loneliness. Some silence can be peace. It was a lesson carried gently through generations, a calm that survived long after the plague itself was gone. So when you hear the soft hum of your own night, maybe the wind outside, the sound of distant traffic, or the steady rhythm of your own breathing, you're hearing something ancient. The quiet that once taught people how to begin again. As life slowly found its rhythm again, something quiet but extraordinary began to happen. The fear that had once filled every night started to turn into curiosity. People began to look up at the stars, at the moon, at the endless dark sky above their towns and villages. For years, The night had been something to hide from. Now, it became something to wonder about. When the plague had raged, the heavens were often blamed for it. Astrologers studied the skies and claimed that the planets had aligned in a way that brought illness to Earth. But as time passed, that fear softened. Instead of seeing the sky as a source of doom, people began to see it as a mystery to explore. In small monasteries, monks who once copied prayers began to copy star charts. They watched the movement of the moon and planets and noticed how shadows shifted with time. Some of these quiet observers would later inspire a new kind of thinking, one that looked to nature for answers instead of fear. Their nightly watch, lit by candles and oil lamps, became the earliest steps toward astronomy. Across Europe, people who had lost so much began to rebuild not only their homes, but their ideas. They questioned the old ways, the same ways that had failed to explain or prevent the plague. If the heavens could change, perhaps knowledge could, too, and so, in the still hours after sunset, minds began to open. Teachers, thinkers, and travelers exchanged ideas in quiet rooms. They spoke softly, but their thoughts reached far, all born out of nights once filled with silence. The sky, which had looked cold and distant during the years of death, now seemed to promise something else. Continuity. Every night, the stars appeared in their same places, patient and calm. Two people who had seen the world crumble. That pattern was deeply comforting. It told them that even when everything below changed, something above remained steady. Villagers began to gather outside again in the evenings. Fires were lit, and people would point out constellations to their children, bright dots of light with names from old stories. Orion, Cassiopeia, the Great Bear. These stories helped connect the living with the past. They turned the night sky into a shared language, one that stretched across countries and centuries. Sailors, too, relied on the stars to guide their journeys. As trade routes reopened, ships began to move again between ports that had once been closed in fear. The knowledge of navigation, reading the stars, following the North Star, became more valuable than ever. The same sky that had once inspired terror now guided explorers toward discovery. Even art began to reflect this change. Painters filled their work with starlit scenes, soft moonlight, and deep skies that seemed to hold quiet wisdom. Writers described the night not as an enemy, but as a teacher, a place where thoughts could travel freely. The darkness, once filled with unseen dangers, became a space for reflection and learning. The beginnings of the Renaissance, that great rebirth of art and science, were taking shape, quietly, under the same stars that had watched over the plague years. It is almost poetic how one of the darkest times in human history led to a renewed love for light. But this time it wasn't only the light of fire or candle, it was the light of knowledge. As cities grew again, scholars built observatories, and bells once used to mark death now rang to announce lectures and discoveries. The night, once silent and fearful, became the setting for study. By lamplight, people read, measured, and wrote, each candle flame a small act of defiance against the memory of despair. The same stillness that had once haunted Europe became the foundation of a new curiosity. People learned that silence did not have to mean emptiness. It could mean space to think. And in that space, the world began to change again. So tonight, when you look at the sky, think of those who once stared at it with wonder after years of fear. Their quiet gazing helped lead the world toward new ideas, new maps, and new ways of understanding. The stars became symbols of healing, far away, yet always there. When the world began to move again, it did so carefully. The silence that had ruled the plague years slowly gave way to the sound of footsteps, wheels, and distant voices. Trade returned first, the lifeblood of towns and cities. Ships once anchored in fear began to sail again, their lanterns glowing faintly against dark seas. Travelers returned to the roads, carrying goods, letters, and stories from one place to another. They rode under the stars, guided by torchlight or by the moon. But though movement returned, it wasn't the same as before. The plague had taught people to value caution, and the night, once full of danger, was now approached with quiet respect. Before the Black Death, inns and taverns were noisy, crowded places. Afterward, they became smaller and more orderly. Travelers preferred clean, well-lit rooms. They avoided strangers who coughed or looked pale. Candles were placed carefully near beds and doorways, not just for light, but as symbols of safety. It was a new kind of nighttime, slower, tidier, shaped by the memory of fear. In many cities, local leaders began to create rules for night travel. Curfews were set, and watchmen once again walked the streets, this time carrying not just lanterns, but also small bells or staffs to show they were healthy. They called out the hours to reassure people that all was well. These night patrols gave a rhythm back to urban life, a steady reminder that safety could exist again. Markets reopened too, but they changed. Before the plague, most markets ended at sunset. After it, people began to extend their hours slightly. In Someton's evening markets appeared, lit by rows of torches. The glow of firelight against stalls filled with bread, cloth, and spices became a welcome sight, a sign that life could still go on after dark. The spread of trade also brought new goods, and with them, new habits. From the east came finer candles, made from beeswax instead of tallow. They burned cleaner, brighter, and without the harsh smell of animal fat. These candles made nighttime life more pleasant and practical. For the first time, families could afford to keep lights burning for reading, sewing, or quiet talk. Light became part of home life, not just a defense against the dark. Travelers brought new ideas as well. They carried stories of how other lands had survived the plague, what customs they had adopted, what beliefs had changed. In this way, nighttime became a shared experience, something universal. No matter the country or language, everyone understood the value of safety, of warmth, of the small light that made darkness bearable. Even the act of traveling at night began to take on symbolic meaning. Writers compared journeys under the stars to life itself, uncertain, sometimes lonely, but guided by small lights along the way. The idea of nighttime travel became a metaphor for human endurance. It appeared in songs, poems, and paintings. The lone figure walking toward a faint light in the distance. That image, born from the real memories of a fearful past, became one of hope. Cities also began to plan their spaces differently. Streets were widened, wells cleaned, and houses built with more windows for air. Public health, a concept that barely existed before the plague, became a quiet part of daily life. People had learned that fresh air and cleanliness could make the difference between safety and sickness. And though they didn't fully understand why, they knew enough to care for the spaces they lived in. Nightlife in these rebuilt towns was simple but meaningful. Families gathered indoors around their hearths. They talked softly, mended clothes, read, or prayed together. From outside, one could see warm light glowing through shutters, a peaceful sight that had been unimaginable during the plague. In those moments, light itself seemed like a sign of resilience. The return of trade and travel connected people again, not just through goods, but through shared humanity. The night, once divided by fear and isolation, became a bridge. From port to port, village to village, the flicker of lanterns and candles showed that the world was waking up again. So tonight, when you think of the lights that mark our cities, street lamps, windows, glowing signs, remember that they are descendants of those first small flames lit after the plague. Each one, in its own way, is part of the long story of how humanity learned to keep the dark at a gentle distance. As the years passed, the memory of the Black Death became a part of every story people told about the night. The darkness of those years had changed how humans understood fear, faith, and the fragile nature of life. And because words have a way of healing what they describe, storytellers, painters, and poets began to turn the memory of the plague into meaning. In churches, sermons spoke of light as a divine gift, a symbol of mercy that guided the faithful through suffering. Candles burned longer and in greater numbers during evening prayers. For many, the small flame of a candle was no longer just a light. It was a reminder that life could endure even in the deepest shadow. The night had taken so much from them, but it had also taught them to treasure each return of dawn. Art changed too. Before the plague, religious paintings were bright, filled with gold leaf and perfect faces. Afterward, artists began to show more realism, faces that looked tired, hands that trembled, and skies that darkened at the edges. Nighttime scenes became more common, painted with deep blues and grays, as if to honor the hours people had once feared. The stars in these paintings shone softly, never harshly. They seemed to say, "The dark can hold beauty too." Writers of the time found comfort in the contrast between light and darkness. They used night as a symbol of reflection, a time to think, to grieve, to wait. In the centuries that followed, this way of thinking shaped some of the most enduring stories in the Western world. Tales of ghosts, pilgrims, dreamers, and lonely travelers all carried echoes of those long plague nights when the world had fallen silent. The theme spread far beyond Europe. In the Middle East, scholars wrote about the night as a time for study and contemplation, a moment when the world's noise rested and the mind could travel freely. In Asia, poets described moonlight as the breath of life after suffering, something pure that washed away fear. Everywhere, the night became gentler in meaning, more human. People had learned that darkness was not always an enemy. Sometimes, it was simply a space for rest and reflection. The way people prayed changed too. Before, prayers at night were often about protection, keeping evil away, keeping sickness from entering the home. After the plague, they became quieter, more personal. People asked for peace, for healing, for understanding. In Mani, homes a single candle was left burning beside a prayer or a name written on parchment. Not as a shield, but as a memory. It was their way of saying, "We remember the dark, but we no longer fear it." The idea of light took on deeper emotional meaning. It wasn't just brightness. It was comfort, companionship, the promise that even if one light went out, another could be lit. When families gathered in the evenings, the act of lighting a candle became almost ceremonial, a small ritual of gratitude. And as these lights flickered in windows across towns and villages, they formed a quiet language of hope, shared by everyone who saw them. In time, nighttime gatherings returned, but they were softer than before. People sang slower songs, told gentler stories, and watched the stars with new eyes. They no longer filled the night with noise to chase away fear. Instead, they filled it with calm. Silence was no longer terrifying. It had become a friend. In art, this new understanding of night inspired some of history's most beloved scenes. Shepherds watching the sky, saints praying in candlelight, travelers resting beside lanterns. Each image carried the same silent truth. That night was part of life, not the end of it. It was the pause between loss and renewal, sorrow and peace. And as the centuries turned, that way of seeing the night endured. Every bedtime story told to a child, every quiet moment spent looking out a window at dusk, they all carried the distant echo of that lesson learned during the plague. That even in the darkest times, humanity finds light, not because the darkness ends, but because we learn how to live within it. So tonight, as you listen, wherever you may be, perhaps with your own small light beside you, remember how long it took for the world to make peace with the night. The stars we see now are the same ones that shone over those silent towns centuries ago, and just like them, we to find comfort in their steady, quiet glow. By the time a new century arrived, the memory of the Black Death had begun to fade into history, but its lessons lingered quiet, powerful, and deeply rooted in how people saw the world. The fear that once filled the night had turned into curiosity. If the darkness could not be banished, perhaps it could be understood. And so, people began to look upward. In small towns and growing cities, scholars and dreamers started to watch the stars more closely. They built simple observatories, crafted instruments, and charted constellations with patience and awe. Before the plague, most people saw the heavens as a fixed order, a map of divine will. After it, they looked at the sky as something alive, changing, full of secrets waiting to be discovered. The same quiet that once brought fear now invited thought. The night became a place of learning, where candles once guarded against death. They now illuminated manuscripts, sketches, and calculations. Monks, scientists, and artists sat beneath the same stars, copying what they saw by hand. Slowly, the darkness turned from an enemy into a teacher. Medicine changed too. Doctors who had seen so much suffering began to question old traditions. They studied the human body more closely, dissected in the glow of oil lamps, and took notes by candlelight. The night was when they worked best, when the world was quiet and the mind could focus. The study of illness became a study of life itself. And though progress was slow, every new discovery felt like a small light kindled in the long shadow left by the plague. In homes, people also became more mindful of health. They slept near open windows, believing fresh air kept the soul calm. They washed more often, kept herbs near their beds, and said their evening prayers not in fear, but in thankfulness. Nighttime became a rhythm again. Not the stillness of despair, but the calm of recovery. The spread of knowledge followed the same paths that once carried the plague. Trade routes that had brought disease now carried books, ink, and ideas. In the evenings, in taverns and quiet courtyards, travelers exchanged more than goods, they shared thoughts. A sailor might bring a new chart of the heavens from Italy. A scholar might speak of strange new machines that could see farther than the human eye. Each conversation was another spark of light, passed from one mind to another. And from these sparks, the Renaissance began to grow. The Renaissance, that great awakening of art, science, and human thought, was born in daylight. Yes, but it was nourished by the night. It was in the hours of silence, when candles burned low and streets were empty, that artists planned, thinkers wrote, and inventors dreamed. They found comfort in the hush of evening, in the way shadows made everything seem larger and more mysterious. Painters studied how moonlight fell on faces, how darkness shaped the edges of form. Writers described stars, not just as lights in the sky, but as symbols of destiny, reason, and faith. Philosophers asked quiet questions, not of what God had planned, but of what humans could understand. The night, once feared as a time of helplessness, became the setting for curiosity, imagination, and rebirth. In the still air of those Renaissance nights, something extraordinary happened. People began to believe that knowledge could protect them, that by studying the world, they could lessen its dangers. It was a peaceful kind of courage, built not on defiance, but on understanding. And so, learning became its own light, one that glowed steadily through the centuries that followed. When you picture those nights, imagine them not as grand or bright, but gentle and steady. A lamp burning beside a notebook, a window open to the stars, a silence filled with the soft scratch of ink. The same world that had once been silent with fear was now quiet with thought. So as you lie in your own nighttime now, think of those who once stayed awake under the same stars, not in panic, but in wonder. They, too, were searching for meaning in the dark, and what they found helped shape the world we live in today. As the centuries passed, the night continued to change, shaped now, not by fear, but by discovery. The same curiosity that had risen in the age after the plague grew stronger with each generation. People had learned to trust observation more than superstition, and slowly, the darkness became a new kind of frontier. The stars, once symbols of fate, became points of study. Telescopes grew larger and clearer. Astronomers, working through long nights, mapped the heavens with patience and care. They recorded the movements of planets, the phases of the moon, the delicate flicker of faraway light. Every discovery deepened humanity's understanding of the universe, and in turn, its place within it. And yet, for all their instruments and notes, many of these thinkers worked in near silence. They kept to the same rhythm the plague years had taught the world: stillness, reflection, attention. The night, once feared for its emptiness, had become a place of thought. In the cities, too, light began to spread in new ways. Oil lamps appeared on corners and bridges. They burned softly, marking safe paths through dark streets. For the first time in history, people could walk at night without the same deep unease that had once followed them. Merchants extended their hours. Musicians played in public squares, and small shops began to glow, even after sunset. It was the beginning of something that would, centuries later, become ordinary nightlife. But in those early days, it was still fragile, like a dream. Each lamp had to be tended by hand. Each flame had to be lit at dusk and extinguished at dawn. The lamplighters, men carrying long poles tipped with fire, became quiet guardians of the new night. Their work gave the darkness a new shape, no longer endless, but gently divided by pools of light. The change was more than physical. It touched how people thought and felt about time itself. Before, day and night had been strict boundaries: work and rest, light and dark, safety and fear. Now, the edges blurred. Artisans worked later into the evening. Writers and musicians found inspiration after dusk. Cities pulsed softly under the stars, alive in ways that would have seemed impossible only a few generations earlier. For the first time, night became part of public life. It wasn't only a time for prayer or sleep. It was a time to think, to talk, to share ideas. Coffee houses opened, filled with a scent of smoke and warmth, where thinkers and travelers gathered to discuss science, philosophy, and art. Inside, candles flickered over maps and manuscripts. Outside, the streets glowed faintly under lamplight. The same world that had once gone silent after sunset was now learning to whisper again. But this new brightness did not erase memory. People still remembered, even if distantly, that there had been a time when night meant loss. That memory gave them a kind of tenderness toward the dark. They still lit candles in windows for travelers. They still spoke softly at dusk. And when they looked at the stars, they still saw more than distance. They saw in a way, the return of light was also a quiet memorial. Every flame that flickered along a street or in a home was a continuation of the first candles lit after the plague. The candles that once stood for survival and prayer, now, they stood for progress and understanding. Light had changed meaning, but its purpose remained the same: to make the world a little less lonely. By the 1600s, some cities, like Paris and Amsterdam, began to organize public lighting systems. They added lantern watches. The lights made people feel safer, but they also symbolized something deeper: the belief that darkness could be managed, not feared. It was as if humanity had finally learned to live in partnership with the night. And through all this, the stars still burned above, unchanged, constant, patient. They had watched over the plague, the silence, the rebuilding, and now this, the awakening of light. Each small invention, each lamp and lens, was another way of reaching toward them. When you look up tonight, you might notice that same feeling, that the night is vast, but not empty. It holds not only stars and history, but memory. The memory of a world that once feared silence, then learned to listen to it. A world that once fled from the dark, then learned to live within it, and finally, to light it gently. By the time cities glowed with hundreds of small lamps, humanity's relationship with night had changed forever. It was no longer only a time to endure. It had become a time to use. People began to shape their days differently. Work, rest, thought, and conversation no longer belonged strictly to the daylight hours. The world was learning to stretch its rhythm, to breathe in a longer cycle. Before, sleep came in 2 parts. People would fall asleep soon after dusk, wake again in the middle of the night for an hour or two, and then return to rest until dawn. That pause in the dark, once filled with fear or prayer, began to take on new meaning. With the comfort of light nearby, people used those quiet hours to read, write, or talk softly with one another. It was a new kind of peace, a gentle middle space between dreams. Writers of the time began to describe this rhythm as the watch. The watch was a moment between worlds, when night was deep, the streets were calm, and thoughts moved freely. Scholars kept notebooks beside their beds, capturing ideas that rose in hate. Artists sketched by candlelight, and travelers, resting on their long journeys, looked out at the dim glow of a distant city and felt less alone. The night had become a companion. In many ways, this change was born from the lessons of the plague years. Once, darkness had forced people apart behind doors, behind walls. Now, light allowed them to share the night again. They began to trust the stillness instead of fearing it. The silence that had once carried dread now held imagination. The glow of lamps on cobblestones brought out new sounds. The clip of horses' hooves, the hum of low voices, the distant echo of music. Night became softer, more human. It was no longer the space between days, but a world of its own. And from that quiet world came creativity. Writers found inspiration in the rhythm of night sounds, in the calm that allowed them to think without interruption. Scientists used its still hours to make observations, to time the swing of a pendulum, to measure the stars, to record the pulse of a living heart. In the hush after dusk, they found patience. The same stillness that once froze the world in fear had become a teacher of precision. Even the way people dreamed began to shift. Dreams had always been mysterious, but now they carried new meaning. Not just omens or warnings, but reflections of thought. People began to wonder what the mind did in sleep, what stories it told, what questions it answered. The night became a space, not just for the body's rest, but for the soul's reflection. In paintings and literature, darkness was no longer an enemy. It was texture, emotion, depth. Artists began to play with light and shadow, showing how beauty could live in contrast. In the soft glow of candlelight, faces looked thoughtful, almost sacred. Writers described night as a time of honesty, when the noise of the world faded and truth could be heard. This deeper relationship with night changed society in quiet ways. People began to stay awake later, but also to value stillness more deeply. Music composed for evening gatherings became slower, gentler. Songs that once chased away fear now celebrated peace. Even religion adapted. Prayers for safety gave way to prayers for understanding. The tone of the night, once defensive, had become reflective. And as homes became brighter, they also became more intimate. A single flame on a table gathered families together. They read aloud, mended clothes, shared food, or simply sat in silence, listening to the faint noises outside. That kind of shared stillness became one of the quiet luxuries of life. Through all of this, the lesson of the Black Death remained that life was fragile, but capable of renewal. Every evening reminded people that darkness would come, and every morning reminded them it would pass. That pattern of trust became the invisible foundation of the modern world. So when you think of the night now, the way we light our homes, the way we drift to sleep, you are seeing the long echo of that transformation. The darkness we once feared became the cradle of thought, of invention, of imagination. The night stopped being something to survive and became something to experience. And perhaps that is the most human thing of all. To take what once terrified us and turn it into something gentle, meaningful, even beautiful. By the 1700s, the night had become a workshop of minds. In cities across Europe, where oil lamps lined the streets and candles burned in study rooms, the quiet hours were alive with thought. It was the beginning of the Enlightenment, the age of reason, and its heartbeat often pulsed after sunset. The thinkers of this new age loved the night. They wrote about it, worked through it, and found in it the stillness they needed to question everything. When the world slept, they examined the heavens, measured the earth, and wondered what held it all together. In that quiet time between dusk and dawn, ideas that would shape the modern world began to take form. Scientists like Isaac Newton stayed awake under the dim light of candles, studying how planets moved. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau wrote about freedom, knowledge, and the power of reason, often in letters penned by lamplight. Even musicians, like Bach and Mozart, composed in the glow of oil lamps, filling the night with patterns that mirrored the order they saw in nature. The night that had once been ruled by silence was now filled with gentle purpose. It was not chaos. It was calm, structured, deliberate. It had become a time for thinking, not hiding. Printing presses, which had spread through Europe in the centuries before, now turned the light of ideas into something tangible. Books multiplied, and knowledge began to travel faster than any ship or caravan ever could. In homes and salons, people gathered in the evenings to read aloud, to discuss new theories, to debate with civility and curiosity. The soft sound of turning pages joined the old sounds of nighttime. The hum of insects, the crackle of firewood, the quiet murmur of thought. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people could share ideas beyond their immediate world. And much of that sharing happened at night. Coffee houses became centers of discussion, bright rooms open late, full of conversation and warmth. Inside, philosophers, merchants, poets, and students gathered around tables, their cups steaming, their notebooks open. In those softly lit spaces, they debated questions that once belonged only to the church or the court. Why do things fall? What is truth? What makes a good life? The night had become a classroom without walls. The Enlightenment changed how people saw darkness itself. In earlier centuries, darkness had symbolized danger or ignorance. Now, thinkers began to use light and dark as metaphors for knowledge and mystery, not as enemies, but as partners. They believed that truth was like a candle flame, small, fragile, but capable of spreading endlessly without losing its brightness. Painters and writers followed the same theme. The contrast between light and shadow appeared everywhere, in portraits, in architecture, in poetry. The candle became a symbol of both wisdom and vulnerability. It could guide the way, but it could also flicker out at any time. Perhaps that fragility made it even more beautiful. Nighttime also brought freedom. In the quiet hours, people could speak and write more honestly than in daylight. Political pamphlets were printed in secret, scientific experiments conducted out of sight of suspicion. The night gave thinkers privacy space to question the world without interruption. It became the hidden ally of change. And yet, even amid all this reason and discovery, the tone of the night remained gentle. Letters written in the late hours often carried warmth and patience. They spoke of friendship, curiosity, and the quiet joy of learning. There was something almost sacred in the act of staying awake to understand the world. The Black Death was now centuries in the past, but its mark endured. It had taught humanity to rebuild in stillness, to find wisdom in quiet reflection. That same quietness now fueled the Enlightenment, not as fear, but as focus. The silence that once separated people had become the silence that allowed them to think together. So when we look back at that age, we see not just a burst of invention, but a change in how people used the night. It became a symbol of reason itself, calm, patient, and full of possibility. The flame that once stood for survival now stood for progress. Each candle on a scholar's desk was another small defiance against the darkness, not in fear, but in understanding. Even now, in our modern cities, lit by electricity instead of flame, that same spirit lingers. When you stay up late, reading, writing, or thinking, you are part of that same long tradition, the quiet lineage of those who found light in the dark. It is a reminder that night is not the end of things, but the beginning of thought. By the 1800s, the world was glowing. The light that had once come only from fire, from torches, candles, and lamps, was now being replaced by something new. Electricity had begun to hum through the cities, and with it, the night itself started to transform again. It was the age of the Industrial Revolution, a time when human energy seemed limitless, when invention was everywhere, and when the rhythm of life began to speed up. Factories filled with machines ran through the dark, powered by coal, steam, and later, current. For the first time, work no longer depended on daylight. The world had learned how to create its own sun. The new lights were bright, cold, and astonishing. They burned steadily where candles once flickered. They lined the streets of London, Paris, and New York, turning what had once been dim lanes into shining boulevards. People walked outside long after sunset, marveling at the glow that seemed to banish shadow entirely. Decadit, progress, and in many ways, it was. But something else changed to something quieter. For thousands of years, night had carried stillness. It had been a time to slow down, to dream, to reflect. Now, it began to lose that calm. Factories roared through the night. Train whistles echoed at midnight. The once silent hours became filled with motion and sound. The darkness that once invited thought now invited work. And though it brought prosperity, it also brought exhaustion. People began to measure their days not by the sun, but by the clock, a tool that cared little for rest. Shift workers labored through what had once been the world's sleeping hours. Cities that never slept began to rise, glowing and restless. Writers and poets noticed this change. Some admired it. The power, the brilliance, the sense that humanity had finally conquered fear. Others mourned it quietly. They missed the natural rhythm of dusk and dawn, the old peace that had once marked the edges of the day. They wrote of how stars grew harder to see, how silence itself had become rare. But even within the new brightness, the memory of the old night endured. Not everyone embraced the constant light. In rural villages, where electricity came late, people still gathered around candlelight and hearth. They kept the older habits, slow conversations, simple songs, quiet reflection, and when they looked toward the cities glowing on the horizon, some wondered whether humanity had lost something subtle but precious. Yet progress moved forward, as it always does. Gas lamps gave way to electric bulbs, and electric bulbs multiplied endlessly. The night that once hid the world now revealed everything. Shadows retreated into corners, and for the first time, darkness seemed optional. Streetlights brought safety. Crime fell in many places. Travel became easier and faster. Hospitals stayed open through the night. Students studied after midnight. The new light, though artificial, carried opportunity, and the rhythm of civilization shifted again. The human imagination adapted to where the old night had inspired stories of ghosts and spirits. The modern night inspired stories of cities, of invention, of motion. Riders described trains rushing through darkness, factories blazing with fire, and crowds moving beneath the electric glow. The night was no longer a pause. It had become a continuation. But the question lingered quietly, even in that golden age of industry. What happens when the night never truly comes? Without the natural dark, people began to forget how to rest deeply. The stars faded from sight behind the haze of light and smoke. Dreams grew shorter, and though the world was brighter, it wasn't always gentler. Still, it's important to remember, this transformation, too, grew out of the same human spirit that had survived the plague. The same need to bring safety, comfort, and meaning into the dark. Electricity was only the latest form of the candle, brighter, faster, and stronger, but born of the same impulse, to live without fear. So when we walk through a lit city at night, we are walking through centuries of memory. Every bulb, every street light, every window glowing against the dark is part of a story that began long ago when a single candle burned beside a plague mask, and humanity decided that even death would not keep it from lighting the night. By the time the 20th century began, the world had grown used to the idea that night could be awake. Cities no longer dimmed after sunset. Instead, they shimmered. Neon lights flashed above busy streets. Cafes stayed open late. Trains ran through the dark, and theaters glowed with life. The night, once quiet and cautious, had become a stage. In places like New York, Paris, and Tokyo, the phrase, "the city that never sleeps," began to mean something real. Music drifted from bars and dance halls. Newspapers printed editions through the night. Radio waves carried voices across oceans, while most of the world lay beneath electric skies. For the first time, humanity didn't simply endure the dark. It filled it with noise, color, and light. Yet beneath this lively surface, something quieter still stirred. The human body, shaped by thousands of years of sunrise and sunset, had not changed as quickly as the cities had. We were still creatures of rhythm, needing rest, needing darkness to dream. And as the lights grew brighter, true night grew rare. Doctors and scientists began to notice what poets had already sensed. People were sleeping less. Their dreams were shorter, lighter, and often restless. Factories and offices worked around the clock, and fatigue became part of modern life. The darkness that once signaled safety now meant inconvenience. A world that never paused began to forget the value of slowing down. Still, the fascination with night remained. Writers called it the modern moonlight. Artists painted city streets glowing under rain, electric reflections shimmering on wet pavement. Jazz musicians played long after midnight, their music carrying that strange mix of joy and melancholy that only nighttime seems to hold. There was freedom in the dark, but also a quiet sadness, because even though the night was now full of people, it sometimes felt lonelier than ever. In old villages, darkness had drawn neighbors together around a single flame. In modern cities, it separated them, everyone behind their own window. Glowing screens replacing conversation, the hum of machines replacing silence. Progress had brought comfort, but it had also changed the texture of human closeness. And yet, in all this transformation, the echoes of the old world never fully disappeared. The instinct to seek peace in the dark survived. Writers, thinkers, and wanderers still went walking beneath streetlights to clear their thoughts. Dreamers still gazed at the few visible stars, wondering what once-filled skies must have looked like before electric glow drowned them out. Even in the noisiest cities, people still sought a little stillness, a reminder of what night used to mean. The world wars came and passed, and with them blackouts briefly returned. Cities that had lived under constant light suddenly went dark again, not by choice, but by necessity. And in those darkened hours, something ancient returned. People looked up and saw the stars again. Some wrote about the eerie.com, how the world seemed to breathe differently when light was gone. It was as if the old night had been waiting, patient and unchanged, just beyond the glow. After the wars, light came back stronger than before. Neon signs multiplied, television screens flickered in homes, and later, computers began to shine through every window. The new light was smaller, more personal, and somehow more constant. The boundary between day and night thinned even further. People could now work, talk, and dream with the world, no matter the hour. But as the 20th century faded toward the 21st, a new kind of awareness began to rise again. Scientists called it light pollution. Poets called it the vanishing dark. And ordinary people began to notice that something was missing the stars. The silence, the natural rhythm that once whispered to the heart when the sun went down. Some began to seek it again. They traveled far from cities, to deserts and mountains, where the sky still opened wide and black, scattered with endless light from above. Under those skies, many felt something ancient stir, not fear, but recognition. The same feeling that medieval souls must have felt when the candle flame flickered and the world outside was unknown. It was the feeling of being small and safe and alive within something vast. The night, it seems, had never really left us. It had only changed its shape. And as we entered the modern age, the question that had followed humanity since the plague still remained. Would we ever truly make peace with the dark? Or would we keep trying to chase it away? Tonight, when you step outside and look at the sky, maybe from your window, maybe from a balcony or a quiet street, you are standing inside a story that began 7 centuries ago. A story of darkness, fear, and survival. A story of how the world learned to live again when the nights grew long and the candles burned low. The Black Death had stripped the world of comfort. It emptied streets, silenced laughter, and filled the night with unease. But from that stillness came something enduring, a human desire to bring warmth where there was cold, and light where there was shadow. Every flame, every lamp, every bulb that came after was a continuation of that instinct. For a time, people feared the dark because they feared death itself. They slept with candles beside them, whispered prayers against the silence, and stayed close to one another until morning. But slowly, the night changed. It became a place, not just of fear, but of thought, of dreaming, writing, inventing, of finding peace. When oil lamps and torches gave way to electricity, we didn't just light our homes, we rewrote what night meant. It was no longer the end of the day, but the beginning of another kind of life, one that stretched beyond time, one that blurred the boundaries between work and rest, between solitude and connection. Even now, centuries later, the echoes of that transformation remain in everything around us. When a street light flickers on, when the glow of a phone illuminates a quiet face in the dark, it's part of that same long history, the same human effort to soften the unknown. The night no longer feels like the enemy it once was. It has become a companion, familiar, tamed, yet still mysterious if you listen closely. And yet, somewhere deep inside us, the old rhythm still waits. Our hearts still slow when the light fades. Our minds still wander when the world grows quiet. There's a reason why reflection, prayer, and dreams come more easily after dark. It's as though the night itself remembers everything. The fear, the hope, the rebuilding. It invites us to rest, not in brightness, but in trust. So perhaps the real lesson left by the plague is not just about survival or progress. It's about balance, about knowing when to light the candle and when to let it go out. Because even as the modern world hums with constant motion, the night still belongs to something gentler. It belongs to silence, to still air, to stars that wait patiently behind the haze. It belongs to rest. Imagine, for a moment, those first nights after the plague began to fade, when the streets were quiet, but life was slowly returning. A single candle glowed in a window. Children, who had once been afraid of the dark, began to sleep again. A mother hummed softly by the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through empty alleys, whispering that the world was healing. And above it all, the stars, the same ones we see tonight, shone down unchanged. They watched humanity learn, again and again, that darkness is not only the absence of light, it is also the space where we remember, where we rest, where we dream. And maybe that's how the Black Death changed nighttime forever, by teaching us that even in the deepest silence, life would find its glow again. So as you lie down tonight, wherever you are in the world, take a slow breath and let the thoughts settle. The night you're in, this very one, carries centuries of courage, memory, and renewal. The same night that once frightened whole cities now wraps you in calm. Let it be what it is always meant to be, a place of quiet, of softness, of sleep. Good night, and may the stars keep their watch above you as they have for every soul who've ever learned to live again after the dark.